Zen Plus, or the Ryzen 2000 series of CPUs, were seen as a refresh of the older 1000 series Zen parts, with a lot of its issues fixed. And while some compared Zen with Sandy Bridge in terms of performance, Zen Plus promised to do better. The Ryzen 5 2600 is the second 6-core 12 threads that we'll be taking a look at. The spec shouldn't surprise anyone, the CPU is well documented on AMD's webpage. The TDP of 65 watts should be taken with a pinch of salt, and an all-core load will have the CPU reaching into the 70 watts. And just like with the previous CPU reviewed, the 2600 was bundled with the same Wraith Stealth cooler. And that's pretty much all that we can learn by just looking at the chip, or the box that it came in. A test system, however, using 32GB of DDR4 RAM running at 3000 MHz and a GTX 970 should help us get more insights into the performance of the 2600. In terms of gaming performance, I opted mostly for multiplayer titles, since those will require frame rates that can drag the system into a CPU bottleneck. However, there are also a few single-player games sprinkled in, known to get CPU bound quite easily. Marvel Rivals is the first multiplayer title to be tested. I ran the game at low settings in the training map at 720 resolution and 30% render scale. The average FPS managed just shy of 160 FPS, with 1% loss above 100. Now, these values are higher than what the system scored at 100% render scale, so I cannot say that I was testing in a CPU limited scenario. But as far as I'm concerned, I cannot blame the CPU for how I played the game. To make sure I get Cyberpunk 2077 in a CPU bottleneck scenario, I played the canned benchmark at 1024x768, using FSR set to ultra performance. The game averaged 100 FPS and the 1% lows were in the low 70s. This is good enough for a single player title. Fortnite is the first game that provided me a sense of how good the Ryzen 5 2600 is. While I tested at 3 resolutions in performance mode, all 3 of them provided the same results, which is the definition of a CPU bottleneck. Around 170 FPS for the average and high 60s to low 70s for the 1% lows. If these numbers feel familiar, it is because you've seen them with a Haswell i7 equivalent Xeon. I should trademark that. Anyway, Fortnite doesn't seem to stretch for more than 4 cores, judging by the CPU usage. Add to that the 2 CPUs covering the same range of frequencies, and we get the same results you see on screen right now. The same happened in Fortnite Reload. Like I say in every review, the smaller map makes it easier for the GPU and shifts the system to a CPU bottleneck. Same resolutions using the same performance rendering mode in a far view distance has the system averaging around 180 FPS and the 1% lows in the high 80s. Out of all combinations tested for Rainbow Six Siege, the 720 resolution and 25% resolution scale is the scenario closest to a CPU bottleneck, frame rates being the same as for 50% resolution scale. The Ryzen 5 2600 averaged around 190 FPS and got the 1% lows above 150 FPS. Good enough for my skill level. What is interesting is that the Haswell CPU managed slightly better numbers. Again, the game did not seem to benefit from the extra 2 cores that the Ryzen comes with. In the case of Apex Legends, however, the 2 CPUs were tied. The frame rates improved as the resolution dropped, so I didn't test any clear CPU bottleneck. Still, 720 resolution and low settings has the Ryzen CPU averaging just above 220 FPS and had the 1% lows above 150. This is remarkably similar to what the Haswell Xeon got, with the Ryzen CPU not getting much help from the 2 extra cores. Unlike Apex Legends, Overwatch has a resolution scale option, so getting the system CPU bottlenecked is easier. However, the 600 FPS cap will level the results of all CPUs capable of reaching it. This is also the case for the Ryzen chip, and it manages an average of 596 FPS and 1% lows above 450. But those results were captured at 720 resolution and 30% resolution scale. I don't have that kind of data captured for the Haswell CPU. The comparison screen on screen right now is at 100% resolution scale, and as you can see, the Ryzen CPU leads the older Haswell quad-core by only 7%. CS2, however, will happily bottleneck the CPU at low settings without the need of a resolution scale option. At low settings, the Ryzen 5 gets similar values at all tested resolutions, with the numbers at 720p being 152 FPS for the average and 79 for the 1% lows. Now, the numbers for Haswell at 720 look worse, but keep in mind that there is some variance in testing using bot matches in DOTA. In reality, both CPUs perform pretty much the same, with averages around 150 and 1% lows around 80. DOTA 2, however, runs better on the Ryzen CPU, At 1080 resolution and low settings, except the render scale that was manually pulled back to 100, the systems are CPU limited. The 2600 averaged 115 FPS and got the 1% lows in the low 60s. By comparison, the Haswell CPU spent most of its tests at 80 to 90 FPS at best, with 1% lows at mid-50s. The Finals is another game that runs better on the Ryzen CPU. At 720 resolution and low settings, the chip got 90 FPS for the average and 61 FPS for the 1% lows. Overall, the processor ran fine in this game, and the 1% lows show that. The issue with the Haswell CPU was the 1% lows. The average FPS was fine. Still, as mentioned, the Ryzen CPU will run better. I started testing Shadow of the Tomb Raider only recently, so I can't do a comparison with the Haswell CPU. The Ryzen chip managed an average of 79 FPS and 39 for the 1% lows. To make sure these results are relevant for the CPU, the canned benchmark was run at 800 by 600 resolution and low settings. And just like the other older games, this title uses only 2 out of the available 6 cores, at least judging by the CPU usage. A similar behavior is visible with Borderlands 3, where the Ryzen 5 2600 averaged 97 FPS and got a 1% loss of 70. I use 720 resolution, low settings and 50% resolution scale to make sure that the limiting factor is the CPU and not the graphics card. However, the CPU usage didn't go above 27%, making this one yet another title that depends a lot on single core performance. At 960 by 540 resolution, Control ran as CPU bottlenecked as it could. The average FPS during my test run between ventilation and the NCP plant was above 150, but the 1% lows failed to go above 60. No worries though, this is a single player title, it's fine. And just like the previously mentioned titles, this one didn't make use of all 6 cores. At best, the 30-something% usage hints at just 2 of them being fully used. Fortunately, Doom Eternal won't mind a second helping from the CPU cores pool. This helps bring the average FPS above 200 and the 1% loss above 130. The data was captured at 800 by 600 to make sure that the GPU is not the bottleneck. Even so, the CPU usage did not go above 70%, implying that the game used 4 cores out of 6. While not ideal, it is still twice what Control used. What I found interesting from the gaming results is that only a few games would utilize more than 2 cores, or 33% in CPU usage. This means that it's the single core performance that is the major cause of the CPU bottlenecks. Video compression, however, is a test that will happily use all cores available. The same GigASUS rendering test completes in 783 seconds when SMT is turned on and in 973 seconds with it off. Using the same method as described in the Ryzen 5 3600 review, we then get a count of clock cycles of 17,378 billions in the first case and 21,596 billions in the second. This means a performance uplift of 20%, matching the power increase from 62 watts to 75 watts. This makes SMT an option best left on, if you ask me. To put things into perspective, the Ryzen 5 3600 finished the same work in about 600 seconds, or shy of 15,000 billion clock cycles, with SMT on. This is a 15% uplift in IPC, from both architectural improvements and increasing cache size for the Zen 2 part. The gaming performance of the CPU is quite close to that of a 4th gen Intel Core i7. Granted, this has to do a lot with the game selected not utilizing properly all 6 cores that the Ryzen chip has. Still, even more recent titles, like Marvel Rivals, fail to drive the CPU usage higher than 70%. This would then have you believe that at least when it comes to gaming, an Intel 4th gen based PC is going to be just as good as one using a Ryzen 5 2600. However, newer titles like the Finals manage to perform better on the Ryzen CPU, despite the similar frequencies at which both the AMD and the Intel chip operate at. It's not just the CPU, it's the faster memory as well. The price of the 2600 is typically in the 30 to 40 USD, higher than that of a 4th gen i7. My problem with this is that 30 USD is probably a fair price. At 40, however, you're better off saving $10 more than trying to snipe a Ryzen 5 3600. This is an odd piece of silicon. Its single-core performance, so important in gaming, is not something to write home about. And while the extra 2 cores help in productivity, it's still less than what the Ryzen 7 brings to the table. This makes me really curious. Is there anybody out there still using the Ryzen 5 2600? Or did you take advantage of the upgrade path? Anyway, this question brings us to the end of this one. Thanks for watching, I hope you liked it, and I'll see you for the next one.